I was 26 when this happened. I don't work at that shipyard anymore, and from what I have heard, the place hasn't really changed. It was a small yard in a quiet coastal town where we repaired fishing boats, little cabin cruisers, battered aluminum boats, anything people could haul in on a trailer. During the day, it felt alive. Customers came and went. Welders threw showers of sparks across the shop. Engines roared during test runs, and forklifts rattled across the gravel. But when everyone clocked out, it became somewhere else entirely. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled over the place little by little, until it felt like the shipyard was holding its breath. Before that job, I'd bounced between construction work and a marina. But boat repair was the first thing I genuinely enjoyed. Every project was different. One day I'd be replacing rotten deck boards, the next rebuilding an outboard engine or sanding fiberglass, until my hands tingled from the vibration. There was something satisfying about watching something that arrived broken leave, looking like it had another life ahead of it. That summer, we were buried in work. One mechanic tore up his shoulder, another quit without much warning, and suddenly we were weeks behind schedule. The owner offered overtime to anyone willing to stay late, and I took almost every extra shift. I wasn't married then. Didn't have much waiting for me at home besides a small rental house 25 minutes away. And I was trying to put away as much money as I could. Looking back, I probably worked more than I should have. At the time, it just felt like the responsible thing to do. I'd been there close to 3 years, so the owner trusted me enough to lock up after everyone else had gone home. Sometimes I'd still be working at 10 or 11, trying to finish a repair before the next morning. People have asked if being alone out there ever scared me. Most nights, honestly, it didn't. Shipyards never become completely quiet. Metal pops as it cools after baking in the sun all day. Loose ropes tap rhythmically against masts. Water pushes against the floating docks with slow, hollow slaps. Gulls argue somewhere in the distance. Every sound has an explanation if you've spent enough time around boats. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The property had an odd layout. One side opened onto the docks and the marsh beyond them. The opposite side disappeared into a thick line of trees that quickly became dense woods. We almost never went back there except to trim branches every now and then because leaves would blow into the work yard. It wasn't a place anyone paid attention to. If someone walked into those woods after dark, I honestly don't know when anyone would realize they were gone. That thought never really bothered me during the day. At night, it was different. Maybe it was because you couldn't see very far beyond the first few rows of trees. Maybe it was because the darkness seemed unnaturally solid back there. Whatever the reason, I always found myself avoiding that direction without consciously deciding to. Even when there was nothing there, it somehow felt occupied. That evening, I'd spent hours replacing sections of flooring inside an old fishing boat. Around 9 o'clock, I'd reached the point where the adhesive needed time to cure before I could continue. There wasn't anything productive left to do, so I cleaned my tools, washed the dust off my hands, grabbed a bottle of water, and stepped outside. Near the edge of the property, there was an old weathered bench overlooking the water. I'd sit there sometimes during breaks because, after staring into engine compartments all day, even marsh grass and gently rocking boats felt relaxing. The air had cooled, and the entire harbor had that strange stillness that only seems to happen after sunset. Even the usual sounds felt farther away than they should have. I remember sitting down, pulling out my phone, and thinking how unusually quiet everything suddenly felt. It wasn't complete silence, It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like something else is listening too. I had a couple of texts from my younger brother asking if I wanted to come over that weekend for a barbecue. I replied, scrolled through a few videos, and let myself enjoy doing absolutely nothing for a few minutes. After a day of crawling around inside boats, sitting still felt like a luxury. The yard had gone unusually quiet. Not silent, shipyards never really are, but quieter than I was used to. The water lapped gently against the docks. Somewhere far off, a gull cried once before everything settled again. It was the kind of stillness that makes small movements stand out. That's when I noticed someone walking across the yard. At first, nothing about him seemed alarming. He walked at a perfectly normal pace, not rushing, not sneaking. If anything, that made him seem like he belonged there. What caught my attention was what he was wearing. His clothes were pale gray, almost washed out, loose enough that they hung from his frame without any shape. The top and pants matched so closely they looked like a uniform. The closest thing I could compare them to was hospital scrubs, except older somehow. Faded almost to the point of having no color at all. When he was about 15 feet away, he stopped. He looked directly at me. There wasn't any anger in his face, no confusion, no sign that he was lost. Just an unsettling calm. In a steady voice, he said, "You need to leave." I remember giving a small, awkward laugh. "I'd love to," I said, "but I'm working." He didn't react. He simply repeated the exact same words. "You need to leave." I stood up from the bench because it suddenly felt strange trying to have that conversation while sitting down. I remember thinking maybe he'd mistaken me for someone trespassing. "I work here," I told him. "I can't just leave." He continued looking at me. Looking back, I can't honestly remember a single expression crossing his face. It wasn't blank exactly. It was almost as if nothing I said mattered to him. He didn't seem frustrated that I wasn't listening. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain himself. After several seconds, he simply turned around and walked away. I stood there another minute or so, watching until he disappeared between the boats. The whole encounter was odd, but I still searched for an ordinary explanation. Every now and then, older people wandered onto the property by mistake, looking for the marina or taking a wrong turn. This man didn't seem elderly, though. For a moment, I even considered following him in my truck to make sure he wasn't heading toward the highway or getting himself hurt. Instead, I convinced myself he'd found wherever he meant to go. I finished my water, tossed the empty bottle into the trash, and went back inside. For the next couple of hours, I buried myself in work. I started another repair while waiting for the adhesive inside the fishing boat to cure. Keeping busy helped push the encounter into the back of my mind, though every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing toward the open shop door, half expecting to see him again. Around 11:30, the shop had become uncomfortably warm from the lights and equipment. So I stepped outside for some air. The breeze was usually stronger near the tree line. The floodlights covered most of the work yard, throwing long shadows beneath the boats. But their light faded quickly where the woods began. You could clearly make out the first few rows of trees. Beyond that, everything blended into a wall of darkness that seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. I wasn't even looking into the woods. My back ached from kneeling all day, and I was stretching when I heard a voice. "Leave." It wasn't loud. If anything, it was calmer than before. I looked up. A man was standing near the edge of the trees. Even now, years later, I still can't say with certainty whether it was the same person I'd spoken to earlier. I never got close enough to compare their faces. But the clothing, it was identical. The same faded gray, the same loose-fitting uniform. The same appearance that immediately made me think of hospital scrubs. That couldn't have been a coincidence. This time I felt irritation creeping in. "What is going on?" I called. He answered without hesitation. "You need to leave." Exactly the same words, exactly the same tone. "I already told the other guy," I said. "I work here." The moment I mentioned someone else, I expected some kind of reaction. Confusion, recognition, anything. Instead, he acted as though I hadn't spoken at all. He was looking directly at me, but it didn't feel like he was listening. It felt like he was waiting. That realization made my stomach tighten. For the first time that night, I stopped thinking he was simply a confused stranger. I wondered if someone was playing a prank. There were a few younger guys around town who loved practical jokes. But this would have taken planning, and it wasn't remotely funny anymore. Without making it obvious, I took a couple of slow steps backward toward the shop. That's when the isolation finally hit me. The owner had gone home hours earlier. No one else was working late. There wasn't another person within shouting distance. If something happened to me out there, no one would know until morning. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked one last time if he needed help or if he was looking for someone. He never answered. Instead, without taking his eyes off me, he reached down beside his leg. At first, I couldn't tell what he was holding. Then the floodlight caught the metal. A machete, or at least some kind of long, heavy blade. The flash of reflected light removed every doubt I had that it was just a stick or a piece of scrap. Then he started speaking. Not in English. Not in any language I'd ever heard. He spoke quickly, almost under his breath, never raising his voice, never breaking eye contact. I couldn't understand a single word. But it didn't sound like meaningless noises. It sounded like someone having a conversation that I wasn't meant to understand. Every instinct I had told me the same thing. I needed to get back inside. Without taking my eyes off him, I began walking toward the shop as calmly as I could, fighting the urge to turn around and run. I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment I showed fear, he would know. At first, I honestly thought getting inside would solve the problem. If this was some misunderstanding, or if the man was having some kind of mental health crisis, I figured I could lock the door, call someone, and let the police sort it out. That still felt like the most reasonable explanation. I only made it a few steps. Then I heard movement behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. He was running, not jogging, not walking faster, running straight at me with complete commitment, as if he'd made up his mind the instant I turned away. He still had that long object in one hand. Whatever chance there had been for a conversation disappeared right then. Instinct took over. I ran. People always say adrenaline makes everything happen in slow motion. But that's not how I remember it. If anything, it felt impossibly fast. 50 yards suddenly seemed much farther than it ever had before. My work boots weren't made for sprinting. I'd spent 12 hours wearing them, and every step felt heavy. Loose gravel shifted beneath my feet, and I remember slipping more than once, convinced I was about to fall. What still bothers me is what I didn't hear. I knew he had to be behind me. I knew he had to be making noise. But I can't remember hearing footsteps. No crunch of gravel, no breathing, nothing. just the sound of my own boots pounding across the yard and my heartbeat somewhere inside my ears. I reached the side entrance of the workshop, threw myself through the door, slammed it shut, and locked it before I even looked back. For several seconds, I just stood there, trying to catch my breath. Then I called 911. I told the dispatcher there was a man outside, carrying what looked like a machete or some kind of large knife, who had just chased me into the building. Keeping my distance from the windows, I eased toward the front of the shop. Boats parked outside blocked parts of the yard, creating long stretches I couldn't see. Every shadow suddenly looked capable of hiding someone. I kept expecting him to appear. He never did. The dispatcher stayed remarkably calm, and I remember clinging to that calm because I definitely wasn't feeling it myself. She asked me to describe him. The clothing came to mind immediately. Loose gray, or maybe faded blue, matching shirt and pants, almost identical to hospital scrubs, average height, medium build, short hair. After that, I realized I couldn't remember much at all. His face was strangely absent from my memory, as though my mind had focused entirely on the clothing and ignored everything else. When I mentioned seeing another man earlier that evening, wearing what looked like the exact same outfit, she asked if I thought they were the same person. I wish I could answer that even now. A couple of hours had passed between the encounters. I never got close enough to compare their faces. I only know the clothes were identical. Eventually, the deputies arrived. Instead of knocking, they called my phone first and asked me to look through the window so I could confirm it was actually them before unlocking the door. That small precaution made me realize they were taking the situation seriously too. Once I let them inside, we walked back into the yard. Part of me expected we'd find the man standing exactly where I'd last seen him near the trees. Instead, there was nobody. The deputies searched between the parked boats, checked around the docks, and looked into the woods as far as they safely could with their flashlights. Nothing. No movement. No voices. No sign anyone had been there. When we reached the edge of the yard, I noticed my flashlight lying on the gravel. I dropped it while running. Until that moment, I hadn't even remembered carrying it. Fear does strange things to memory. The deputies had me walk through everything again from the beginning. I told them about sitting on the bench, the first man calmly approaching, his quiet warning. "You need to leave." How I'd explained that I worked there, how he'd simply walked away. Then I described the second encounter near the tree line, the identical clothing, the exact same words, the blade catching the floodlight, the unfamiliar language, the chase. Saying it all out loud made it sound unreal, even to me. It's frustrating how memory works when you're terrified. You assume you'll remember every detail for the rest of your life. Instead, whole pieces disappear. Some moments remain crystal clear. Others feel like someone tore pages out of the story. The deputies asked whether there was a hospital, treatment center, or mental health facility nearby where someone might have wandered away. I honestly didn't know. As far as I was aware, there wasn't anything close enough that walking to the shipyard would have made sense. Eventually, they finished searching. They never found anyone. No weapon, no footprints. Nothing that explained why someone had been there. What stayed with me wasn't even the chase. It was the warning. Both men, whether they were two different people or somehow the same one, had said exactly the same sentence. "You need to leave." Not a threat, not a demand for money, not an argument, just a warning. For years I've wondered what they thought I needed to leave from. The owner told me I didn't have to work nights for a while after that. For the next month or so, I only worked regular daytime hours. Every now and then, I've tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe the matching clothes belonged to some work crew. Maybe there really was only one man, and the darkness distorted my memory. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary reason for everything that happened. I still don't know. What I do know is that running was the smartest decision I made that night. And after I eventually left that job, I never went back to that shipyard after dark again. I was renting a little house during my last year of college. The place was cheap because it had been sitting empty for quite a while after the owner moved into assisted living. It definitely showed its age, but I didn't care. I was a college student with a part-time job, and cheap rent mattered a lot more to me than fresh paint or modern appliances. My parents were far more concerned about the house than I was. My mom called every few days, usually asking the same questions. Are you locking your doors? Have you met any of the neighbors yet? I'd laugh and tell her everything was fine. For the most part, it really was. My days followed the same routine. Classes during the day, evening shifts at a veterinary clinic a few times a week, then weekends spent catching up on laundry, studying, or sleeping far later than I probably should have. Nothing exciting ever happened there. At least, not until that night. The house had a few odd little features that gave it some character. One of them was the bathroom window. It was a small, frosted glass window set high in the wall facing the narrow side yard. The glass was textured enough that you couldn't actually see outside. If someone walked past, all you'd notice was a vague shape or a shift in the light. You couldn't recognize a face or even tell exactly what you were looking at. I'd never really paid attention to it before. That evening, I got home around 7. I remember texting one of my friends while we tried to plan a movie night for the weekend. Everything felt completely ordinary. Before settling in, I checked the locks out of habit. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. Nothing seemed unusual. Around 9, I decided to take a shower because I had another early shift at the clinic the next morning. The bathroom was tiny. You could practically reach the sink, toilet, and towel rack without stepping out of the shower. I just finished rinsing the shampoo from my hair when something moved across the window. I froze. The shape crossed the frosted glass at a perfectly normal walking pace. Even without being able to make out details, my brain recognized the outline immediately. It looked like the side profile of a person. The thing that made my stomach tighten wasn't what I saw. It was where I saw it. That window wasn't anywhere near the sidewalk. For someone to pass that close, they would have had to be walking right alongside my house. Close enough that they almost could have reached out and touched the wall. I rinsed the soap off as quickly as I could without taking my eyes off the window. Part of me expected the figure to come back the other direction, or stop, or do something. Nothing happened. The window stayed perfectly still. As soon as I shut the water off, I wrapped myself in a towel and stepped into the hallway. I remember wondering whether the steam had distorted a shadow somehow. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe tree branches had moved at just the right angle. I checked the front door first. The deadbolt was still locked. The security chain was still in place. The back door hadn't been touched either. After getting dressed, I even walked barefoot around the outside of the house. I checked both narrow side yards, behind the detached garage, around the backyard. There wasn't anyone. There really wasn't anywhere someone could have hidden without me noticing. Eventually, I talked myself into believing it had been nothing more than shifting shadows or steam playing tricks on my eyes. The explanation never completely satisfied me, because deep down, I knew what I'd seen had looked like a person. I tried to forget about it. I finished getting ready and walked into my bedroom to change. The bedroom sat at the end of the hallway, and I almost always left the door open. I just pulled a clean t-shirt over my head when something caught my eye. Something was drifting into the room. At first, I thought it was dust floating through a beam of light. Then I realized it was moving differently. It looked like a thin ribbon of gray smoke slowly curling through the doorway from somewhere out in the hall. Not a lot. Just enough to make me stop moving. I smelled it almost immediately. It wasn't cigarette smoke. It wasn't the scent of a fireplace either. The closest comparison I could make was melted plastic. An acrid, chemical smell that reminded me of overheated wiring, though not quite the same. That frightened me more than the strange shape at the bathroom window. A fire made sense. A hidden electrical problem made sense. Those were things I knew how to respond to. I hurried around the bedroom checking every outlet. Nothing felt warm. Nothing looked burned. Just to be safe, I unplugged the bedside lamp anyway, trying to convince myself that there had to be an ordinary explanation. Even as I did, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the smell hadn't started in the room at all. It had drifted in from somewhere else. I followed the smell into the hallway, expecting it to get stronger somewhere. Instead, it faded almost as quickly as it had appeared. I walked through every room in the house without really knowing what I was looking for. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt hot. Nothing was smoking. I even pulled the television away from the wall because I convinced myself maybe a power strip had overheated. Nothing. Eventually, I opened the back door for a few minutes. I came up with an explanation that felt comforting enough to believe. Maybe someone nearby had been burning trash. Maybe the smell had drifted in through the slightly open living room window, and by the time I'd walked into the hallway, my brain had connected that strange smell with the shadow I'd seen in the bathroom. It wasn't a perfect explanation, but it was normal, and normal was exactly what I wanted. Looking back, I realized how determined I was to make everything fit into an ordinary story. I told myself I was simply tired after work. I'd seen an odd shadow. I'd smelled something unusual. The two events had blended together in my imagination. That was easier to accept than any other possibility. To distract myself, I decided to make dinner. Cooking always helped me stop overthinking. I filled a pot with water, set it on the stove, and pulled a jar of pasta sauce from the cabinet. The kitchen sat around the corner from the hallway, so unless I leaned out, I couldn't actually see the bedrooms from where I was standing. I was chopping leftover chicken I'd cooked the day before when it happened. The water hadn't even started boiling yet. Music was playing quietly from my phone, even over that. I heard it. A door, not a creak, not the house settling. The unmistakable sound of an interior door swinging open hard enough to strike the little rubber stopper on the wall. I froze. I knew exactly which doors I'd left open before starting dinner. The only one I'd closed was the bathroom. I hadn't even had time to call out when another sound followed. Glass rattling. Then the sharp scrape of a window sliding open. And immediately after that, the unmistakable sound of someone landing outside. Everything happened so quickly that my brain struggled to keep up. I ran toward the living room. As I rounded the corner, I caught a glimpse of someone climbing out through the side window. I only saw them for a second. They wore dark clothing. I couldn't tell whether they were a man or a woman because they never turned toward me. The moment they hit the ground, they sprinted between my house and the neighbor's fence and disappeared. The window stood wide open. I remember staring at it in disbelief. I knew I'd locked the house. More importantly, I'd been walking around inside it for the last half hour. Someone had been in there with me. Without thinking, I backed away from the window instead of moving toward it. Later, I realized that was probably the smartest decision I made all night. If whoever had climbed out wasn't actually alone, if someone else was still inside. Walking toward that window would have left me completely exposed. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and called 911. I didn't wait inside. I walked straight out the front door and stayed in the driveway. At that point, I no longer trusted that the house was empty. The neighbor across the street noticed me pacing back and forth and came over to ask if everything was all right. Trying to explain it out loud made it sound unreal. I think someone just ran out of my house. He immediately started scanning the street while I kept looking back toward the front door, half expecting someone else to walk out. Neither of us saw anyone. The officers arrived a short time later. They cleared the house room by room, every closet, every bedroom, even the crawl space access in the hallway ceiling. No one was inside. When they finished, we walked back through the house together. The side window where I'd seen the person escape was still open. It wasn't broken. The lock didn't appear damaged. There were no shattered pieces of glass. Whoever had climbed out hadn't forced their way through it. They had simply opened it. That unsettled me more than a broken window would have. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd touched that window. As we stood in the living room, something on the floor caught my attention. I only noticed it because the overhead lights were on. Scattered near the edge of the rug were several small black blobs. Some were about the size of quarters. Others were even smaller. They almost looked like little pieces of burned rubber. Before I could kneel for a closer look, one of the officers crouched down first. Instead of picking one up, he carefully touched it with the back of a finger, as though he wasn't entirely sure what it was either. The officer looked at me and said, "Don't touch these just yet." Naturally. About 30 seconds later, the moment he walked toward the hallway to inspect something else, I ignored him. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached down and lightly touched one of the black pieces with the tip of my finger. I jerked my hand back immediately. It was hot, not warm, hot enough to sting. A small red spot appeared on my fingertip almost instantly. That surprised me more than anything else. Whatever those things were, they'd been sitting on my floor for several minutes by then. They shouldn't have still been holding that much heat. The officer came back, pulled a pen from his pocket, and carefully lifted one of the pieces with the tip before dropping it onto his notepad. Up close, it looked like melted plastic. At least, that's what it resembled. But something about it wasn't right. Instead of sticking or stretching the way softened plastic normally would, it stayed together in one hard lump. The closest comparison I can make is hardened tar. It looked burned, but it didn't behave the way burned plastic should. As we stood there examining it, the smell returned. The exact same smell. Burned plastic or melted chemicals. I immediately told the officer that was the odor I'd noticed long before I ever saw someone climbing out of the window. That got his attention. We started looking more carefully. There were more of the black pieces scattered throughout the house. One in the hallway, another near my bedroom door. When I walked into my bedroom, I felt my stomach drop. 2 more pieces were sitting on top of my comforter. That realization disturbed me more than anything else we'd found. It meant whoever had been inside hadn't stayed in one room. They'd been in my bedroom, while I was somewhere else in the house, completely unaware. Under one of the black pieces, the fabric had partially melted. It had shrunk inward as though something extremely hot had rested there for several seconds before being removed. The carpet beside the bed had a similar mark. So did a small area near the living room couch. The damage wasn't extensive, just little isolated spots, tiny reminders that something incredibly hot had touched those surfaces. The officers searched for footprints outside. The ground had been dry for weeks. There wasn't much to work with. One of them asked whether I'd accidentally melted something while cooking. I told him the smell had started long before I'd even turned the stove on. Nothing had burned in the kitchen. Another officer suggested the black material might have come from something the intruder was carrying. Maybe part of a tool had overheated. Maybe it was melted plastic from some piece of equipment. That explanation sounded reasonable, until I thought about where we'd found it. If someone had been carrying a hot object, why were pieces lying on my bed? Why were others scattered through the hallway? They didn't form a trail. They weren't concentrated in one place. They were simply here, there, almost random. That never made sense to me. I didn't spend another night in that house. I drove straight to my parents' home. The landlord replaced every lock the following day. At my dad's insistence, someone even inspected the crawl space beneath the house because he couldn't stop wondering whether there had been another way inside. Nothing unusual was found. The material was never fully identified either. I remember asking about it later. The officer admitted they couldn't confidently explain what it was. That uncertainty bothered him too. Eventually, the investigation simply ended. No one was identified. No one was arrested. Life moved on. Not long after I moved into another place, my parents convinced me to adopt a larger rescue dog. I'd wanted one for years anyway. But I'd be lying if I said that night wasn't part of the reason I finally did it. Looking back, there are 2 parts of that night that still stay with me. The first is the figure outside the bathroom window. That happened before I had any reason to think someone was inside the house. Before the strange smell. Before the door. Before I heard the window slide open. Before I watched someone climb out. The second is the smoke. Nothing I've heard since then explains why a ribbon of gray smoke drifted through my hallway, carrying that burned plastic smell, only to disappear without a trace. Minutes later, we found those black, still hot pieces scattered throughout the house. Maybe there's a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe there isn't. I honestly don't know anymore. What I do know is something I rarely think about until someone asks me why I still double-check my locks every night. Someone I never saw clearly was inside my house while I walked from room to room, believing I was completely alone. They moved through multiple rooms without making enough noise for me to notice. They passed close enough to the bathroom window for me to see their silhouette while I was in the shower. They stood inside my bedroom. They were there. long before I ever realized I wasn't alone. I can accept that someone somehow got into my house. I can accept that they escaped before the police arrived. Those parts, as frightening as they are, have ordinary explanations. The part I still can't put behind me is everything that happened before I even knew they were there. I was 30 when this happened. I lived in that house for about 3 years, and for most of that time, it was one of the quietest places I'd ever called home. The subdivision backed up against a stretch of woods, one of those pockets of forest developers leave untouched because clearing it isn't worth the cost. Most of the houses had privacy fences, but they all ended at the same tree line, so it never really felt like the woods belonged to any one backyard. They were just there, watching over the neighborhood. It was also the first time I'd ever lived completely alone. My parents helped me move into the rental after I was promoted at work. Being able to afford a place without roommates felt like a milestone I'd been working toward for years. I remember standing in the empty living room after they'd driven away, realizing the entire house was mine. It was equal parts exciting and intimidating. Life settled into a comfortable routine. I'd leave for work around 7:30 every morning, get home a little after 5, make dinner, watch television, and go to bed. Weekends were usually spent cleaning the house, calling my parents, or inviting a friend over for dinner. Looking back now, it was probably the most stable period of my life. And maybe that's why what happened afterward felt so out of place. Nothing dramatic ever happened in that neighborhood. At least, not at first. One of the reasons I'd rented the house was the backyard. Rabbits were everywhere, especially early in the morning. And every now and then, I'd hear coyotes calling somewhere deep in the woods after dark. I never actually saw one. The neighborhood Facebook page was constantly filled with people complaining about raccoons tipping over garbage cans, or the occasional black bear wandering through during certain months. But my street always seemed peaceful. Quiet enough that you noticed when something was different. The house next door sat empty for months after I moved in. Every week the grass grew a little taller, and I remember wondering if someone had simply forgotten about the place. Eventually, I learned the owner lived out of state and had been trying to find new tenants. Then one day, without any warning, someone had moved in. I never saw a moving truck. I just came home from work one afternoon and noticed a pickup parked in the driveway. That evening, the porch light was on for the first time in months, making the house look occupied again. I didn't think much of it. As far as I could tell, only one person lived there. There was never more than a single vehicle outside. I never introduced myself. I'm not especially outgoing, and neither were most of the people on our street. We'd wave if we happened to be outside at the same time, maybe exchange a quick hello, but everyone mostly kept to themselves. The first time I really noticed my new neighbor, he looked exhausted. I'd guess he was somewhere in his 40s. Everything about him seemed worn down. His clothes were always wrinkled, almost like he'd slept in them. His hair looked uneven, as though he'd cut it himself with a pair of dull scissors. He wasn't dirty exactly, but he had the appearance of someone who hadn't taken care of himself in quite a while. Whenever we happened to be outside at the same time, he'd look at me. Not wave, not smile. Just stare for a few seconds before quietly turning around and going back inside. It made me uncomfortable, but not enough to think much of it. Every neighborhood seems to have one person who keeps to themselves a little too much. I assumed he was ours. A couple of weeks later, I was home cleaning the kitchen one Saturday afternoon when I happened to glance out the window above the sink. That window looked directly toward the side of his house. He was standing inside, perfectly still. He was behind one of his front windows, looking straight toward my kitchen. The moment our eyes met, I expected him to look away. He didn't. He just stood there, watching. I remember standing at the sink for another few seconds, trying to decide whether he was actually looking at me or simply staring out the window. It's strange how quickly your mind starts searching for innocent explanations when something feels wrong. Eventually, I stepped away. I told myself he probably hadn't even noticed me. About 10 minutes later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked again. The room was empty. That should have been the end of it. It was odd, sure, but not alarming. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Over the next few weeks, though, I started noticing him more often. Even now, I can't honestly say whether he changed or whether, after that afternoon, I simply couldn't stop looking for him. Once, I saw him standing near the tree line behind our properties. He wasn't walking. He wasn't doing yard work. He was simply standing there, looking up into the trees. For several minutes, I remember wondering if he'd seen an animal or a bird's nest. It was strange, but not strange enough to tell anyone about. None of the things he did ever crossed that line where you think, I should probably call someone. They were just unsettling. One Sunday afternoon, I was upstairs putting clothes away when something outside caught my attention. I happened to glance through the bedroom window. It was him. He was in my backyard. For a second, I genuinely thought I had to be mistaken. I even blinked, expecting him to disappear once my eyes focused. He didn't. He was walking slowly across the grass behind my house as though he had every right to be there. What I noticed first wasn't even that he was trespassing. It was his feet. He only had one shoe on. His left foot wore a dirty old sneaker. His right foot was completely bare. It was such an oddly specific detail that my brain latched onto it immediately. He wasn't moving with any real purpose. He wandered across the yard as if he'd forgotten where he intended to go halfway through the walk. I never considered going outside. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was and carefully lowered the blinds just enough that I could keep watching without feeling like he could easily see me. I remember wondering if he somehow knew I was there anyway. He eventually stopped beside the small flower bed my mom had helped me plant a few months earlier. Watching him touch something she'd helped create made the whole thing feel strangely personal. He crouched down, reached into the dirt, picked up what looked like a small stick, held it in front of his face for several seconds, as though it was something worth studying. Then he quietly dropped it back onto the ground. No explanation, no reason, just another thing that made absolutely no sense. After a while, he walked toward the back fence. He stopped, turned once toward my house. Even from upstairs, it felt as though he was checking whether someone was watching. Then he slipped back through the gate he'd apparently entered and disappeared. For almost a month after that, nothing happened. At least, nothing that obvious. I'd occasionally see his truck leave the driveway. Sometimes I'd notice lights glowing inside his house long after midnight. Other times I'd go 2 or 3 days without seeing him at all. The longer it went on, the more I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he was dealing with mental illness. Maybe he was on medication. Maybe he'd wandered into my yard by accident and hadn't even realized where he was. Those explanations were uncomfortable, but they were still better than the alternatives. I remember mentioning him to my mom during one of our weekly phone calls. I told her he seemed a little strange, the staring, the backyard incident. But I also remember trying to make it sound less serious than it felt. She immediately told me to keep all my doors locked. I laughed and told her I already did. Then she asked if I wanted my dad to come over and check the house. I told her that wasn't necessary. Looking back, I wish I hadn't been so quick to brush it off. A few nights later, on a Friday, I came home from work completely exhausted. I barely had enough energy to make dinner. After cleaning the kitchen, I headed upstairs much earlier than usual. The weather had finally cooled off, so I opened my bedroom window for a little while. Every now and then, I could hear distant laughter drifting through the trees from somewhere in the neighborhood. It felt ordinary, comforting even. Eventually, I closed the window, locked it, turned off the overhead light, left my bedside lamp on. Like always, I left the bedroom door open after brushing my teeth. I climbed into bed and started scrolling through my phone, waiting until I felt tired enough to sleep. I don't know exactly what time it was. It couldn't have been very late because I was still wide awake. I wasn't paying attention to anything except my screen. Then something made me look up. Even now, I don't know what it was. Maybe I sensed movement. Maybe the room had become too quiet. Maybe some part of my brain noticed something before I consciously did. Whatever the reason, I looked toward my bedroom door. Someone was standing there. It was him, my neighbor. For a second, my mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. I knew I'd locked every door downstairs before coming up to bed. I knew I hadn't heard anyone inside the house. Yet there he was, standing silently in my doorway, watching me. Something filthy was draped over one shoulder. At the time, the only comparison my brain could make was a body bag. I've never been able to say with certainty that it actually was one. It was just the closest thing it resembled. The material was faded gray, stained with dirt, and ripped open along one side as though it had been dragged across rough ground or torn on something sharp. In his other hand, he held a large metal tool. For years I called them scissors because that's how they looked in the moment. Later I realized they were probably closer to heavy garden shears. The instant our eyes met, I screamed. Everything happened at once. He swung his arm. The metal tool left his hand and flew across the bedroom. It slammed into the wall behind my bed with a sharp crack before clattering onto the floor somewhere out of sight. He didn't hesitate. He came straight toward me. By the time I reacted, he was already reaching across the corner of the bed. His fingers brushed my wrist. For one terrifying second, I thought he had me. But he never got a full grip. I threw myself backward across the mattress with every bit of strength I had, and his hand slipped away. For a split second, the bed became the only thing separating us. Instead of trying to climb over it, I ran around it. That decision probably saved my life. Every time he moved around one side, I was already circling toward the other. It wasn't a plan. It was pure panic. I just knew I had to keep something between us for as long as I could. I never stopped screaming. I remember hearing his breathing growing heavier as he kept reaching for me, frustrated that he couldn't quite catch me. Then I saw an opening. I made it around the foot of the bed and into the hallway before he could. The moment I reached the stairs, I didn't look back. I ran, down the hallway, down the stairs, straight to the front door. The only thought in my head was simple: get outside. I unlocked the door, threw it open, and sprinted barefoot across the front lawn. The grass, the gravel, the edge of the sidewalk, I barely felt any of it. It wasn't until I reached the street that I realized I'd left everything behind. My phone, my shoes, my purse, everything. I ran to the closest house because their porch light was still on. I pounded on the door as hard as I could. No answer. To this day, I don't know whether nobody was home or whether they were simply too frightened to answer the door for someone screaming outside in the middle of the night. Either possibility makes perfect sense. I turned and ran farther down the street. By then, I don't even remember what I was yelling. I was just making noise. The husband at the next house opened the door almost immediately. The look on my face must have told him everything. He didn't ask questions. He and his wife pulled me inside, locked the door behind me, and handed me a phone. That's when I called 911. The officers arrived quickly. They searched my house from top to bottom. He was gone. There was no sign he'd ever been there. They searched the neighboring house as well, or at least that's what they later told me. The pickup truck was still parked outside. Furniture was inside, but there wasn't a single person in the house. I stayed with my parents for the next several days. I couldn't even think about sleeping in my own bedroom again. As the investigation continued, one detail disturbed me more than anything else. The owner of the neighboring property was eventually contacted. He told investigators he hadn't rented the house to a man. He had rented it to a woman. He'd met her in person. She signed the lease. She paid the deposit. She picked up the keys herself. Everything was in her name. As far as he knew, a single woman had been living there the entire time. I remember asking whether she'd later let a boyfriend move in. He said he honestly had no idea. He lived several states away and hadn't been back after handing over the keys. I told them something that surprised everyone. I never saw a woman, not once. Every single time I looked toward that house, the only person I ever saw was the man. The detective couldn't explain it. He suggested maybe someone had been staying there without permission. Maybe whoever rented the house had lied. Maybe someone else's identity had been used. All of those possibilities sounded reasonable. None of them answered the question that mattered most. Who was he? As far as I know, they never found him. Eventually, the lease ended, and the owner came back himself to clear out the house. By then, I had already decided I was leaving. I moved before my own lease expired. Losing a little money meant nothing compared to spending another night in that bedroom. One thing still bothers me. The officers never found obvious damage to my doors or windows. I know I locked the house. I checked them myself, which means somehow he had gotten inside before I ever went upstairs. The thought of that has stayed with me more than the chase itself. He wasn't breaking in while I slept. He may have already been inside while I was downstairs cleaning the kitchen, waiting. The filthy bag over his shoulder has haunted me too. I've never been able to prove it was a body bag. It was simply the closest comparison my mind could make in that moment. It looked old, worn, stained, as though it had already been carried for a very long time. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe it wasn't. I'll never know. What I do know is this. He wasn't a stranger who wandered through my neighborhood by chance. For more than a month, he had been living one house away from me. He watched me through my kitchen window. He wandered through my backyard wearing only one shoe, behaving as though ordinary rules didn't apply to him. And all that time, I kept convincing myself there had to be a harmless explanation. There are still questions no one has ever answered. Who was the woman on the lease? Did she even know he was living there? Did she willingly rent the house for him? Or had someone used her identity without her knowledge? Maybe she was completely innocent. Maybe she was connected. I'll probably never know. I've lived in several different homes since then. Every one of them has been perfectly ordinary. But there is one thing I've never done again. I've never rented another house that backs up to the woods. Even now, when I see a tree line stretching behind a neighborhood, part of me still wonders who might be standing there, watching.